Hey guys, today I'm here to make this video about my opinions on the use of a monolingual dictionary and my opinions on the monolingual transition in general. Today I'm going to be explaining what the monolingual transition is and what I feel its benefits and disadvantages are, and whether I feel going monolingual is a necessary part of reaching a high level in your target language or not. And in another future video, I will talk about my own experiences going monolingual and explain that I didn't even go monolingual when learning Portuguese, for example. I will also talk about what some other immersion methods have recommended on this topic, such as my opinion on the idea of making a monolingual transition very early or of using techniques like recursive lookups. And then I will talk about if and when I recommend you go monolingual in that video as well. So anyways, let's just hop in and talk about what the monolingual transition even is. The term monolingual transition is a term often used in immersion learning circles, but some of you might still not know what that means. So let me briefly explain it. The monolingual transition refers to changing from learning your target language through your native language to learning your target language through your target language itself primarily. You might notice that I used the word primarily in the previous sentence. That is because although there are some communities in the immersion learning space that recommend learning the meanings of every word through a monolingual dictionary, I am not in that camp. And personally, I don't agree with that perspective at all. As I have said in a previous video about vocabulary cards, the majority of concrete nouns, which I define as nouns which either have a one-to-one correspondent meaning in your native language or that can be understood by viewing an image, should probably never be studied in a monolingual dictionary. But if you want to find out more about why we at Migaku feel that way, stay tuned because I'll be talking about that later in this video. But before we do that, let's talk about the benefits of going monolingual. From my own experiences, I can say with a pretty high degree of confidence that the monolingual transition is far more valuable for languages that differ a lot from your native language than for those that don't. But the reason for this is probably not clear at first glance. In my opinion, the main reason this is because for languages that differ a lot, there tend to be far fewer words outside of concrete nouns that have one-to-one correlations, or that are otherwise very easy to define in your native language. Some people therefore like to claim that you can't define certain target language words in another language. But is that really true? A word that I've often heard this claim made for is yappari or yahari in Japanese. If we take a look at an English definition of this word, we can see that it's given various meanings. These are definitions from several bilingual dictionaries, and it's pretty clear that what tends to happen is that the meaning of a word is often attempted to be expressed in terms of the type of words that we would use in our native languages in a similar usage case. If we pay attention, we can see that there has been no attempt made to define the word in its own terms in any of these definitions. And in my opinion, this is what leads to a sense of confusion and a lack of clarity when using a bilingual dictionary. This tends to be the case for the vast majority of bilingual dictionaries. Let's take a look, on the other hand, at one of the meanings of this word in a Japanese dictionary entry. 何かしてみたものの結果が以前 Now, if you understand Japanese, I believe you will agree that this more detailed way of defining the word leaves much less room for confusion than simply being given a list of words used similarly in your native language. But is there really no way to say the same things in your native language? Well, I think there absolutely is. The meaning of that definition can be translated very accurately into English. For example, expresses that the result of something you did is the same as before when you did it on another occasion. Now, I think that this type of bilingual definition, coupled with usage examples, and perhaps also having those native language words of similar meanings listed as well, would certainly have a big impact on the learner's feeling of clarity towards the meaning of the word. But even then, without seeing multiple usage examples of that word at a given interval, you're probably pretty unlikely to acquire it. And the more complex the usage cases of a given word are, the more times you'll actually have to see it before you begin to intuitively understand it. A word is both its meaning and its usage, and in order to acquire a word, you need to understand both. But the dictionary entry of a word, not including example sentences, can only provide assistance in understanding that word's meaning and not its usage. And if a word's usage is of sufficient complexity and you don't have a usage example, you wouldn't even be able to guess and would have no idea how that word is used and therefore be incapable of acquiring it. But on the other hand, acquiring words merely by seeing usage examples in your immersion will happen every day as you continue on your immersion learning journey. And as I will talk about a little bit later in this video, the vast majority of these complex words tend to be very common and are studied early in a learner's journey using a bilingual dictionary. Yet they are acquired nonetheless, so it should make it abundantly clear that you don't acquire words simply by reading their definitions. Rather, you acquire them by either having an idea of their meaning from a dictionary and also seeing them used in different examples, be it in the dictionary itself or in your immersion. Or you acquire words by guessing or discerning their meaning from context just by running across them in your immersion. So what people really mean when they say that you can't define a certain target language word in your native language is not that you can't define that word, but rather that you can't define its usage, which I would agree with. But as I have demonstrated, one can accurately translate the meaning of a target language word into their native language, and in such a way that no meaning is lost. So what I feel is the real benefit of a monolingual transition is that monolingual dictionaries tend to be of much higher quality than bilingual ones. A reach goal of Migaku is actually to release a series of dictionaries that would define words in the same way that a target language monolingual dictionary does. And although that's a really big project that can't be prioritized right now, it's one that I'm really excited about going forward. But in the meanwhile, I believe that if your target language is sufficiently different from your native language and your level is high enough to make use of a monolingual dictionary, that you will naturally grow to prefer them over time. First, I just want to say that if someone is already at a sufficient level to use monolingual dictionaries in their target language and that their target language is pretty different from their native language, then there realistically are no downsides to them primarily using monolingual dictionaries. But I still definitely do see some downsides to trying to use a monolingual dictionary 100% of the time. And there are definitely some downsides to trying to use a monolingual dictionary too early. For concrete nouns, or namely nouns that have a one-to-one correlation from your target language to your native language, or that can be expressed in an image, then I recommend always using a bilingual dictionary or doing an image search for that given word. These are words such as dog, oak tree, or cinnamon or something. The fact is, describing concrete nouns is in itself a specialized skill that I believe is pretty far removed from regular language acquisition. And there is almost no benefit from a language learning perspective for learning these nouns using monolingual definitions. But there definitely are negatives in doing so. If you're ever curious later about how these types of words are defined in your target language, then sure, of course, you can look them up and read through some of those definitions on occasion. But I would highly recommend against making this the mainstay of your learning process, or you're just going to needlessly slow yourself down. Just look at these two different ways of describing the word dog. Look at that. There's no need to bother reading a target language definition when a single word in your native language or a picture will suffice. The next thing I want to say is something I learned from my experience studying Portuguese. As I became more proficient in the language and began to experiment with using a monolingual dictionary, I very quickly came to understand that it seemed to be a detriment in the Portuguese to English language pair. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at preparar in a Portuguese monolingual dictionary. Arranjar algo de forma a poder ser utilizado. And now, let's take a look at the English definition. Prepare. I think you kind of get my point right away. There are a huge number of nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and more that share an exact meaning between Portuguese and English. And more often than not, their usage cases in both languages are identical as well. So I very quickly decided that rather than go monolingual for Portuguese, that I would continue to primarily use a bilingual dictionary first, and would only use a monolingual dictionaries in situations that I felt confused and that I would benefit from doing so, which admittedly was a pretty small minority of the time. So before you go monolingual just for going monolingual's sake, remember that for most of us, ideally, dictionary lookups would be as fast as possible. If you're not actually losing any clarity of meaning in a bilingual definition, and if that definition is much quicker to read, then in my opinion, there's no point in forcing yourself to prioritize a monolingual dictionary in those cases. Rather, I would suggest that you continue primarily using a bilingual dictionary and spend more time with your immersion content rather than spending that time reading definitions. I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy the process a lot more that way. The next point I want to make is that there seem to be some people that recommend learners try to go monolingual very early in the process. I highly recommend against this, but I'm not going to go into detail about that in this video. So make sure you catch my video about going monolingual if you want to know more about this in detail. Anyways, trying to use monolingual dictionaries too soon can make language learning miserable. And as I talk about later in this video, it's not even necessary to go monolingual to reach a high level. So prioritize making language learning enjoyable and sustainable. Later on, when you get to a level where you can understand the vast majority of words in a monolingual dictionary entry, then you can begin to integrate their usage if you choose to do so. And again, I reiterate that I recommend that if your target language is sufficiently different from your native language, that you at least try to use a monolingual dictionary at some point, as there are definitely a lot more benefits in using a monolingual dictionary in that circumstance. But again, I will make a video about this in the very near future and explain exactly how you should go about integrating the usage of a monolingual dictionary into your learning process. Without a shadow of a doubt, I can tell you that going monolingual is not a requirement in order to reach a high level. I will also say that when you reach a pretty high level, you will not have an issue using a monolingual dictionary if you choose to do so. Sure, it might be a bit of a process to get used to using them, but once you do get used to it, they might even grow to be your preference. But that aside, why can I say with such confidence that going monolingual is not necessary? Well, that's because it simply isn't. The vast majority of difficult to define words with many different meanings and many different usage cases tend to be very common. Say we were to take a hypothetical group of language learners and that group would be made up of people who would all eventually go on to become fluent in their target languages. We can almost certainly say that the vast majority, if not all of these learners, would study the vast majority of these difficult to define words with many different meanings and usage cases early on in their learning journeys through the use of a bilingual dictionary. We can also say that the vast majority of these learners don't end up going back later to look these words up in a monolingual dictionary. Sure, some of them might do so because of curiosity, but it will almost certainly not be because of need. But why is that? Well, that's because, as I said earlier, acquisition doesn't even require a dictionary lookup to begin with, be it in a monolingual or bilingual dictionary. It simply requires having a sense of what a word means and being exposed to it in an understandable context a sufficient number of times at a sufficient interval. As long as you meet this criteria, it's not ultimately gonna matter whether you initially looked up this word in a monolingual or bilingual dictionary, or even if you didn't look it up at all. And in fact, you will ultimately acquire a huge number of words without ever looking them up if you simply continue to immerse. And even though I personally think that studying flashcards in a spaced repetition system will ultimately expedite you on your journey to fluency, the SRS should not be used in a way that you try to encapsulate the entirety of your knowledge in your target language. There were a huge number of words in my target languages that I never studied in an SRS. So does it make any sense sense to think that at some point, someone would become incapable of acquiring new vocabulary unless they started using a monolingual dictionary? Of course not. That doesn't make any sense and goes against the very basis of how immersion learning works. But again, having access to high quality definitions, whether those be from bilingual or monolingual dictionaries, and perhaps even more importantly, having access to high quality usage examples will certainly facilitate the acquisition of new vocabulary. So just keep it in mind that while not strictly necessary, depending on your own circumstances, transitioning to using a monolingual dictionary may definitely be substantially beneficial. Another argument that I've seen about why the monolingual transition is necessary is that reading definitions of words in a monolingual dictionary will familiarize yourself with how to describe the meanings of words in your target language. Well, let's examine that thought for a moment. What does that even mean? And does it really have anything to do with the sort of language ability most of us are after? The ability to define words in the way that a dictionary does is not an ability that we find even among our most eloquent speakers of our native languages. It's a very niche ability that only a minuscule subset of any population can do. The vast majority of people never look up definitions in a dictionary on a frequent enough basis to familiarize themselves with how words are usually defined in them. Instead, when we usually think about the way people describe the meanings of words to each other in a colloquial sense, we know that the way most people do so is not in the way that definitions are written in a dictionary. So it's pretty clear that this is a very niche ability that the vast majority of native speakers don't have. And I can also say that the ultimate goal of language acquisition is to be able to translate words from your target language directly into meaning in the language of thought. This is how we interpret language every day, and this ability to describe words in the way that a dictionary does doesn't really benefit us under most circumstances. Sure, perhaps it could be useful to sometimes reason about a word while reading, but even if we really wanted to acquire this skill, is the best way to really go about doing this by making sure we make every lookup in a monolingual dictionary? From what I know about skill acquisition, it almost certainly isn't. The best way to learn a skill is just to focus on that skill. So the best way to learn how to read a monolingual dictionary and to describe words as they do is simply to immerse in the definitions of monolingual dictionaries. Now, you could do this as part of your reading immersion, for example. But even while doing this, you could be using a bilingual dictionary to look up the words that you didn't know. This sort of more dedicated approach would certainly lead someone who wanted to acquire this skill to acquire it much more quickly than they would if they were simply doing their lookups in a monolingual dictionary on occasion. Sorry to be verbose, but as someone who's intimately interested in skill acquisition, it's abundantly clear that the question about whether someone wants to acquire this ability and how to go about acquiring it is completely separate from the question of whether a monolingual transition is necessary in order to acquire your target language. And the answer to the latter question is that it's not. So guys, prioritize whatever keeps you moving forward, and don't let anyone tell you that you have to make some monolingual transition in order to acquire your target language. That's just not true. That's it for today, guys. I hope I've helped to dispel some of the dogma surrounding this topic. I could talk about this topic for hours, so the lack of clarity in this video definitely leaves me wanting. But I feel that in this video, I've at least laid out the basics of the way I think about the monolingual transition. So if this is your first time being introduced to this topic, I hope that you now have a basic framework about how to think about it. And for those of you who are already familiar with the monolingual transition and have your own opinions about it, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. And also make sure you check out my next video on the monolingual transition when I put it out. It will have a lot of pragmatic information about how to actually go about carrying it out. And please consider supporting Migaku on Patreon. In doing so, you'll gain access to the official Migaku Discord community and early releases of all Migaku software projects, including the Immerse with Migaku browser extension, which allows for the creation of instant SRS flashcards from Netflix, YouTube, your local video files, and your favorite websites. And at the backer tier and above, you can directly participate in proposing and voting on new features, as well as take part in exclusive talks with the Migaku team and me, where we decide on what direction direction Migaku will take. Migaku is growing and we have some pretty big announcements coming up, including the introduction of 2 new members who've joined the Migaku team. I hope to introduce them to you in the very near future. We truly appreciate all of the support and hope that we can continue to add value to you through our work. But if you can't afford to support Migaku financially, we completely understand. I've been there before. If you'd like a chance to win free special VIP access to the Migaku Discord community and Migaku software projects, please consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment on this video. If you can, please leave your Discord ID or Twitter handle in the comment so that it's easy to contact you and let you know if you've won. We currently choose 15 people at the end of every month to get a sneak peek at the community we're building, and that number increases every time a new Patreon milestone is reached. If you need support with one of our software projects or would like to join the official Migaku Reddit community, you can find those links in the description below. And of course, I want to thank all of our supporters on Patreon. You make all of this possible, and we really appreciate each and every single one of you. Special shout out to the backers tier. I'm really excited to talk to you guys again at the next backers meeting this week. And I'm eager to see what new features voted on for this month. And a special thanks to all the patrons who've helped me with bug testing this week. Your guys' help was invaluable. Last but not least, special thanks to the $1 Leech tier. Unfortunately, the Migaku team has decided to change the name of your tier. So one last time, let's get some Leech pride in the comment section below. Hope you guys found the video useful. See ya.